Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what? Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool.
My guests on the podcast are Cheryl Clemons, CEO of Learner Lab and Storytiger, and Steve Rayson, who founded Kineo, BuzzSumo and Anders Pink. They're both successful entrepreneurs. They've both given a huge amount to the learning industry, but they're also marketers, probably the two smartest and most effective marketing people I've come across in workplace learning. So if you're an L&D person wanting to use marketing techniques to engage your learners, or a learning tech startup or scale up trying to establish a brand and generate sales, you're going to get some useful insights from this conversation. We cover a lot of ground in this chat, including brand, influencer marketing, user-generated content, product design, AI, and evaluation. But I start by asking the contentious question, is it really right or advisable for an L&D person to think like a marketer? So, Steve and Cheryl, I'm going to put my cards on the table here at the beginning of this and say I don't think L&D people or talent developers should take the call to think like marketers too literally, because marketers are basically transactional. And people like me, they're red in tooth and claw, they're evil people, and they have a cynical, limited view of human motivations. It's either fear, greed, or personal advancement. And personal advancement in the most narrow sense. But learning people, surely, L&D, they're there to make people's lives better. They're there to develop and enrich people to expand their horizons. And it seems to me that's a fundamentally different mindset. So what do you think about that? Who wants to attack that proposition first?
I think I'm inclined to agree partially, and I think this will probably get unpicked during our conversation. But I think that learning has had quite a long-standing, strange and complex relationship with marketing. On the one hand, I think people think it's kind of shiny and frivolous, which perhaps, pertains to some of the things that you've mentioned, John. And then on the other hand, that it's kind of leading the way with engagement. And I think we have been, debating this for probably, 10 to 15 years. I think I remember some kind of early conversations with Laura Overton around kind of marketing and how it can support learning. So it's definitely a kind of long-standing debate, and one that probably has evolved significantly since we started. And I think that probably has been a little bit of a shift from the transactional, where we were very much looking at kind of events-based kind of training and supporting learning in that regard, to perhaps now a slightly more kind of strategic look at it in some quarters around how it kind of can support digital learning transformation, culture, looking at the more strategic elements of marketing, like, really kind of understanding audience, looking at the motivations and so on. I know I haven't read all of it, I must confess, but in the first chapter or two of Nick Shackleton-Jones's new book, How People Learn. On
everybody's bookshelf at the moment. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm about 12%, I think, on my Kindle. But, I certainly get where he's coming from in terms of learning and marketing sharing a lot of the same kind of motivations in terms of trying to make a connection with people. So if we take it in its kind of purest, ungreedy form, there is, quite a lot of parallels, I think, that we can take from that.
I would agree with you, I think, in the sense I don't think they should necessarily think like marketers. I mean, people in learning departments have quite different tasks to do in terms of understanding learning psychology and getting to people to improve at their jobs, etc. But there's certainly things you can learn from marketing, because we are, in the learning sense, you're still trying to compete for people's attention. You're still trying to make them aware of the things that you're trying to get them to learn. And I think you're also trying to get them to engage. And I think there are things you can learn there from marketing, which is different from learning. But you don't want to necessarily think like a marketer, as you say, because marketers can be quite cynical about the way they do it. But equally, if people are going to do learning, they have to be aware of it. It has to gain their attention, and people have to engage with it. And so there are things there that you can definitely learn from marketers. I think marketers are very good at how do you gain somebody's attention, and how do you actually then get them to engage with content. So I think marketers are good at that and have been working on it a long time. And sometimes I think there's not enough of that in the learning space. But that's not to neglect all the important things that people on the learning side do and shouldn't lose. So marketing is just one aspect.
If we do purely focus on, thinking like a marketeer, then that is pretty kind of myopic. And particularly with kind of increases, I guess, learning as a service and people kind of self-directing, kind of pulling down with resources and so on, the whole piece around user experience, customer experience, is really kind of critical to supporting, an engagement with learning and ultimately, I guess, effective learning.
So how does that translate in a learning context? So I suppose you talk about learner experience, and people are talking more and more about learner experience platforms.
I guess on the kind of platform side, the whole kind of user experience piece is really important to help people engage with the platform, but I guess it kind of extends into really kind of optimizing success with it as well. So some of the lessons, for example, from kind of software as a service apply really well to the that kind of learning environment.
Well, while we're on the technology, let's kind of address that, because one thing that's very different to the learning world and the marketing world, from my point of view, is the technology tools you have to deal with. Steve, you know this about this intimately, because you've created point solutions, let's call them, like Anders Pink and BuzzSumo. The marketing world now is full of point solutions. Although things like HubSpot exist and Salesforce, marketers tend not to go for the big platform solutions. In learning, on the other hand, we are really kind of, companies have a huge amount of platforms, your talent management platforms, your learning management system, everything's got management in it. It's a 3-letter acronym. If you want to think like a marketer, how do you reconcile the difference between those two different tool sets, do you think?
I think it's one to think about what you're trying to get people to do. I think sometimes the problem with the larger platforms or an LMS, it's a bit like, I think marketers have learned a lot from websites. In the old days, people beautifully designed websites and had a great homepage and navigation because they expected people would come in and they would navigate and they would browse and they would do things. The reality is that marketers found that's not the case. I mean, most people actually, they read an article on a website because somebody's recommended it or they've seen it somewhere else. So they click a link from social media or somewhere else and they go to the article, they read it, and they often bounce out again. They're not really going to that homepage and browsing. And so what marketers have learned is that you just have to put your content everywhere. So you have to be ruthless. So, and you go where people are. So if people are on Instagram, you go to Instagram, or you go to Facebook, or you go to Twitter, or wherever they happen to be, if they're in LinkedIn groups or whatever. But you're trying to push your content or your marketing message everywhere you can. And I think there was a naive assumption that we all had when we started with websites, is that people would come to this beautiful homepage and they would navigate. That's not the reality. Maybe if you're the Guardian or the BBC, maybe you'll have that privilege. But for most of us, people come into a specific piece. And I think it's the same about an LMS. People don't go to an LMS to browse what's an interesting piece of learning that I should do this week. There's normally a need, and so people want to learn about something. And so I think you have to find ways of pushing that back to them. So how do you reach a learner may need some support with Excel, whatever it happens to be, a piece of learning, managing teams, whatever it happens to be. At what point do you reach them? How do you get that to them? And I think what marketers have learned a lot is you try to get to the point of need. So at the point they're thinking about it, let's push that to them. And so they will use more technology solutions, such as retargeting ads, so they know they'll just go back to you with the same product. So when you're on a relevant page, they'll remarket that back to you. So I think the difficulty, if you're thinking about an LMS as a platform, people come and browse, etc. I don't think that's ever the case. I think generally you've got to drive people to specific pieces of content, and I think that's what marketers try to do by really selling the value of that piece of content that they're doing. So they're trying to meet a need. They're trying to meet a very specific need, and they're trying to provide something which they think has value that the user will actually engage with. So I think in the learning context, you have to do the same. So you might have a beautifully designed LMS, that's fine. But if you want people to get to that specific piece of learning, you need to approach that into how do we get that piece of learning in front of people. And marketers are just relentless, I think, at just pushing it on every channel you can, because that's really the only way that works, is you're just relentless about pushing that out in multiple channels to try and reach that individual, really.
Something that comes up with marketing, I think, as well as with learning, is user-generated content. Storytiger, I'm obviously thinking of in this connection, Cheryl. You see relatively little of it, I think, in learning, but Storytiger is a great example of how the technology can enable it. Do you want to talk a bit about that in this context? Yes. I'm giving you the chance of a free plug here.
Thank you. So we basically put together kind of Storytiger, which is a guided user-generated mobile video tool to help anyone share real kind of learning stories using video. And a lot of people, of course, say, why can't you do that on WhatsApp? Why can't you just use your phone? Which you'd have thought would be the kind of ultimate kind of democratization of it. But really, people actually really quite struggle to reflect on their kind of own experiences. And also need kind of guidance and a kind of guidance structure to help them create compelling short videos that people are likely to watch. So that was, a kind of a key kind of driver for us to support that reflective thinking and also really kind of capitalise on, for learning, the demand in video in the kind of consumer space. But of course, they are two very different environments. Although I think that in terms of, Steve, you were saying about how a lot of people kind of go to a website because it's been kind of recommended, for example. Still with user-generated content, I think there's been some research recently through Degreed, actually, which shows that the bulk of user-generated content is shared from others as opposed to being kind of created personally. I think it's something like 7.4 or something percent of people actually self-filming learning videos to share, which actually I think is quite a high number.
Very high for creators.
Absolutely, for creators. And you would still find, if you think about, all the videos, of course, that go onto YouTube, in terms of the kind of representation there against the rest of the population, I'm assuming it's quite a bit lower than that. So I think there's people definitely need kind of support around sharing those and structuring those videos, which Storytiger certainly does. But we shouldn't be too kind of put off if actually it starts with quite a kind of small group of people that share those stories, because actually I guess that kind of 7.4 is is at the point of kind of creation in terms of the kind of point of impact, and people actually watching those stories and doing something with it. There's obviously a kind of amplification and multiplication effect that we would never have if the individuals weren't kind of encouraged and to actively kind of capture those fantastic stories. And often those are the ones that do have the kind of the struggle, the challenges, the lessons learned that you don't necessarily get through, classic e-learning or, other content that perhaps is kind of driven by kind of top-down kind of expertise.
I mean, there is a much bigger push now to user-generated content because it's more authentic, and so brands play to that quite a bit. So I think, and it touched on the notion of curation, that you don't have to create all the content. Content can be created in many different ways that may exist. But I think Cheryl touched on the point, but how do people find it? Other people share it and recommend it. And I think one of the things that marketers have learned about is the role of influencers. What makes somebody engage with a piece of content? And often it's because somebody they respect or trust has recommended it. So if you recommend a podcast to me, John or Cheryl, I would listen to that because you've recommended it. So you've done some editorial work for me and said this is worth listening to. And I think the same is true in learning. If your colleague says, this is an excellent, you really should see this video or read this article or do this piece of learning, And I think marketers have really cottoned onto that quite well. So, and you're not talking of David Beckham as an influencer, although that can happen at certain levels. But it's just, who do these people respect? Who do they trust? And so what marketers do is try to get to those people. They have strategies which are called influencer marketing strategies. So if they're going to target compliance officers, who do compliance officers respect? Who do they trust? And they get them to recommend products, because people don't trust it coming from a marketer. So they engage with that sort of second tier in terms of influencers. And I think that's something learning departments could learn more from, really, which is in terms of, who, so the people doing the management course, who do they respect? Who do they trust? Are you engaging? Try not to engage directly with that audience, but engage with the influencers who then become your advocate. So I think marketers have spent a lot of time and are quite sophisticated in the way they do influencer marketing these days, which may be something that learning departments can pick up on. We found when we were doing the BuzzSumo, we started with a marketing strategy with very little money, but we targeted influencers. But we didn't just want an influencer to mention us in a tweet, because that's fairly worthless. You actually need to build advocates. You really want an influencer who's on a stage saying, I really recommend you use this thing. And I had an experience recently where I was promoting a survey, a podcast survey. Nobody likes filling in surveys, so it's really difficult to get people to fill in surveys. So I thought, how do I get people to fill it in? And I got the host of the podcast, as a guy called David Runciman, in this case on Talking Politics, to actually say to his listeners, can I ask you to fill this in for me? And because of their trust in him, literally within hours, I had 900 people fill in the survey. And the power of an influencer that people respect is huge, really. So finding those people and working with those people. But I think it's not just like someone tweeting out, this is useful. It's really building advocates. And I think advocacy is quite important. So that may be something you could learn, is who those advocates are in your organisation.
I agree. And I think it's important that trust extends from the influencer through to the content itself, which perhaps is a kind of growing area.
I'm not sure we've said quite enough about brand. Did you have anything you want to say about building a brand, a learning brand?
I do. I actually looked back at a blog post, funnily enough, that I wrote 5 years ago around this, about L&D kind of building a brand, and basically mentioning about how, whether they like it or not, they've got one. But I think my thinking around this has kind of evolved since then, in that the brand for learning within an organisation does need to be, particularly kind of closely aligned to the whole people brand, the whole colleague brand, and then ultimately right up to the whole kind of organisational brand. And very clearly kind of linking into purpose, which is absolutely vital. I think Steve touched on value, the importance of kind of sharing the value of kind of learning or content earlier. It has to do that. And actually, funny enough, when I was looking at this blog post earlier, I found quite an interesting quote from a chief digital officer at Ogilvy that I think kind of still stands, which I might just mention if I've got it here. With consumer behaviour changing so quickly, understanding that the path to purchase is actually a path to purpose has meaningful implications for brand advertising at all stages along the consumer journey. So I think that there's, we touched on that whole kind of cross-platform piece that's really prevalent in the kind of consumer world earlier. That is really important, I think, within the corporate organisational world as well, where L&D can actually look at where people need this learning at the point of need throughout their kind of colleague journey, and look at the digital and physical environments that people are kind of placed in, and make sure that that value and purpose is driven across all of it. I think is really kind of key, rather than kind of just thinking that it's, as you know, on the LMS or it's for this particular time. I know there's lots of talk about kind of learning in the flow of work and so on. And I think that brand piece is really important around it, so that people constantly kind of understand the kind of purpose and that kind of bigger strategic sort of side of marketing, as opposed to just that, you know, come and check this out and get the bum on the seat.
I'd like to challenge that slightly in that I think that there is slightly a tension. I understand what you say about organisational alignment. I think that the trouble is if you create a brand that's completely aligned with the messages of the organisation, you do tend to come up with something quite dull and worthy, and something that people don't necessarily feel talks to them on the level that you can really engage their emotions and the most deep-seated sort of beliefs and values, because those really lie outside work.
I completely agree. So actually the challenge is to really kind of understand the audience, look at the organisational kind of mission, values and purpose, and actually have a kind of brand messaging and kind of movement that brings those two together, which is absolutely possible, and people do this all of the time, but I don't think it's necessarily part of the current L&D skill set. But that's where I think it needs to be.
Yeah, I think brand is important. I mean, when you're building a company, you're really building a brand, or you're building a department, you're building a brand, and it's important to have your values and things. But what's really important is that people's experiences reflect that brand. It aligns with the brand values that you're trying to portray. So you can say lots of things, and the danger is people have nice, new, shiny bits of the brand, the sort of superficial bits of the brand, but if the day-to-day experience doesn't match, then that's no good. If people, you know, if you're dealing with a company and they're not responsive, they're not friendly, they're not helpful, then there's no point having friendly, helpful sort of marketing materials if your experience at the call center is the complete reverse, really. So I think, to me, a brand is an accumulation of people's experiences. So you have to drive that through your own people in the learning department to make sure that they, and it's a trite thing to say about living the brand, but so that it gives people the experiences they expect, really. Because I think sometimes they just don't connect. You create a nice brand, which is almost like a branding agency comes in and does that, but it's people's experiences, so you have to deliver the experiences. So what do you want them to have? You want them to have valuable learning experiences. You want them to come across content which is unique, because if you're not providing content that's unique, are you adding any value? And that's the problem when you're doing content marketing. It has to be unique. It has to deliver value to the person at the other end. So you have to be delivering learning that you know is really valuable to people, feel it's valuable, etc., and that's unique to them. So you have to, the brand isn't just all those things about values, but you need them, and you need the direction. But it's really what's the day-to-day experiences of the people. So when people in your organisation come in contact with the learning department, what are those experiences? What do you want them to be? And how do you make sure they happen, really? Yeah,
my take on that would be that where you get that from is that comes out of the team that are creating it, that they can mobilise the people within the organisation and have them participate in it in a design thinking sort of process, so that people are actually living and visioning the brand themselves, if it doesn't sound too poncy. Yeah, you have to make it real to your people. I mean, I know when we started at Kineo, what do we want? And we had this thing about a Kineo person, and it was a really simple part of the brand, which is really happy, positive people. That sounds a bit simple. We want to recruit happy, positive people. We want people to be positive, because sounds like an REM lyric.
Yeah, the way you deal with people. If somebody has a problem, you know, this project deadline has to move, etc., you can deal with it with, oh God, how are we going to do this? Or, okay, we're going to deal with it in this way. And positive people deal with it in the same way. But we just reinforce that every day on every project is, are we being positive, etc. But you have to push that through all of your people, because otherwise it doesn't align with the brand. As you say, the experience then becomes very different. But if you have people that, and I've always liked that belonging, believing, behaving sort of philosophy that the church has, which is that if you feel you belong, if you believe in what you're doing, you will actually behave in the right way. And I think that applies to brand as well. So if you have people who say, oh yes, we feel we belong in Kineo or wherever, we believe in this positive approach, etc., then people behave in the right way. And so, as you say, you then don't need to nudge people in particular ways, because actually they're part of that process. So to me, it still comes back to that brand experience. So then people hopefully had dealings with Kineo, they would deal with people who were positive, even if there were problems. On every project there are problems. Stuff goes wrong all the time. Stuff goes wrong. So you have to accept that. But how do you deal with it? As long as you deal with it positively, that's a good thing. So you just keep reinforcing that, I think, and that's reinforcing part of your brand throughout. Yeah, funnily enough, I've come across more people on the practitioner side, I think, who really get what brand's about than on the vendor side. I think vendor side, too many people tend to think that the brand is the logo.
Yeah, still.
Yes.
I just wanted to pick up on your point, last point, Steve, which is around that kind of almost kind of co-creation of the brand, which I think is really important.
Yes.
So it's not, I mean, it's certainly not a static thing. I completely agree that it's the full kind of brand experience. And obviously what supports and makes that full brand experience are the people that are part of it. And certainly with kind of user-generated content and user-generated video and so on, there's an opportunity for people to kind of share their stories and make sense of purpose and all of those things as part of the brand that they're also a part of.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think the other thing that brand comes back to is the product itself, because you know about branding can really get over a bad product, really, and so the product has to deliver the value, and that's part of your brand. And so, I mean, that's people talk about Apple and all things about brand, but actually it's because the products have value. They're easy to use, they're robust, they're secure, and Apple probably the only people who really look after your privacy because they have a different model, because they're really selling hardware and other things, whereas Google's actually selling your data. So I wouldn't trust my data to Google phone, for example. I would choose an Apple phone because I think, there's something about the essence of what they're doing. But it's about the product, I think. So you've got to think about what's the product we're delivering in learning. So are the courses of the value? Are they delivering what people need in terms of their careers, in terms of their job? Does it make it easier for them to do their jobs, etc.? So I think it's difficult to overstate the importance of getting what you produce to be of real value. So Basumu, we did incredibly well because the product was great. People recommended the product to other people because their experience of using it was easy, for example. I say, if it was a bad product, no amount of branding and marketing is going to put that right.
Exactly.
Really.
And did it help that the people who were going to market it were also the people who were creating the product?
I think it does help because you then understand
very
it.
Often, as you know, you'll be in the position where, I've found as a marketing person, here's the product, sell this. And very soon you find you're pushing back on the product. Say, look, I'm sorry, people don't want this. I can kind of buy as many adverts as you like, but people aren't going to get it because it's got this basic problem with it that you could fairly easily fix. And all your competitors haven't got that. So you're pushing back against product design. And the more that process goes on, the more it's a plea for marketing always to be involved in product design. So I think when marketing is right from the beginning, the whole thing becomes a lot easier.
Yeah, and it's a simple word, but it's about value. It's delivering value, and value can mean lots of things in different contexts, really. But I mean, my background, as you know, recently has been in content marketing, and to me, the content has to deliver value to the user, which comes back about how do they create value from it. And when I ran our blog site, I mean, I just rejected 90% of the content that people submitted for it because saying it's not original, it's not going to add any value. They can read another article and do this. If you're not adding anything, they could do a course from somebody else, they could read an article from somewhere else or watch a video from YouTube. You've got to add something which is of real value. So you've got to set, I think, quite a high benchmark for your own products, which is the learning we're delivering the best we can deliver? Does it really deliver? Is it help people? In my experience, people want to do their job well. Most people want to do their job well. So if you can deliver something which helps people do their job well, that's half your battle, really, and that's half your brand, because you're then helping them do their job well. They will recommend it to somebody else. So you can't divorce, this idea of getting in a brand agency and build the brand of the learning department. That's fine. But the starting point before marketing, the starting point is the product itself, I think. So the product is the best marketing you can have.
The Learning Hack Podcast is brought to you by John Helmer Consulting. If you're a startup or scale-up looking to grow your business in learning technologies, we offer 20 years experience and all the creative and strategic support you need. To make a real impact with your marketing and thought leadership, visit johnhelmerconsulting.com today. I'd like to move on now to kind of the more cutting edge of marketing and the technology that is coming from marketing into learning. And you've mentioned curation there. So curation, discovery of content, access to content, that's kind of where we are seeing the leading edge stuff happening now with bots. I think it helps to have a driver here. And I know one organisation recently where the business said to the learning department, you've got platforms coming out of your ears, LMS and talent management platforms, all the rest of it. We're not going to give you any more money for platforms. What we're going to give you money for is to sweat those assets, to drive people to that content, to realise the value that realise the investment you've made in the platforms. And the result of that was to create a learn bot, an AI-driven learn bot. And I think that's an interesting development. Do you want to talk a bit more about AI and data and how that is changing things?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a big buzzword in marketing at the moment. I mean, I think it's still some way off is the reality of AI. But I mean, what marketers want to do is they want to find the right audience for their products. So it's slightly different from learning because they will build products and they'll try and find the right audience to buy that. And they'll use data a lot, so big data and AI to sift through to understand what people are looking for. It's still early days, I think. But
also, we don't have big data in learning, really. The data set's quite small.
Yeah, data set probably is smaller in learning. I mean, in marketing, there's a huge amount of data, and it is getting better. I mean, they do understand a lot more, because, I mean, there are things you can just simply buy on Facebook. So you can buy people's ages, genders, all those sorts of things. So you can target particular audiences, but because you need quite a lot of data to target and personalize. I mean, it must be the case that we need different types of content and all those sorts of things for the challenges that we face, but you need quite a lot of data to then deliver that.
An interesting thing I saw recently was in the marketing world was conversational surveys. Now, you were talking earlier about, Steve, about surveys and how people have survey fatigue. I think conversational surveys are quite interesting because they're sort of AI driven. And they've been used in sort of customer service surveys. You know, you went to this hotel, you had this holiday. What did you think about it? And it follows a bot logic. So if people say, well, I had a really bad experience as in a free form text thing, the AI can pick up on that sentiment and say, okay, it was bad. What exactly was it bad about it? Was it, the hotel room, the service you received?
I think bots are interesting. Chat bots are interesting combined with AI. I have a friend of mine who set up a startup really doing call center style things. So when you get to a website, all the initial conversation is handled by a chat bot effectively using AI, which is, what are you interested in? What are the issues? What are the problems? So I could see you could start to apply some of that sort of technology, and that's getting better and better in terms of you don't know initially whether you are dealing with a chat bot or whether you're dealing with a human, and that will just improve over time.
Is it, some of it's that, isn't it? I guess it's kind of voice recognition technology needing to get a little bit better. The whole kind of sentiment piece, I think, is going to be really interesting, when we can start actually understanding how people are kind of reacting, especially on the kind of visual and VR and video side as well. What kind of, gestures and emotions actually trigger reactions in other people when they watch it, and what do they go on to do? There's lots of quite exciting things, I guess, that kind of will potentially come together over the next few years.
When I started off my career in marketing, it was in a direct marketing agency, and you would plan your campaign, mail it out, and maybe a week later you'd start to get some responses back, and you would track that over a number of months. Now with digital media, that process is instant, and AI is changing that even more, so that you have send out, analyze, change tack. That is happening kind of in real time on the fly. So you're in dialogue with the customer, and and this is what is happening in a lot of bot exchanges, is that it is actually interactive. And we're hearing about a thing called conversational marketing now, which reflects that change. So increasingly in marketing, what you're going to need as a new skill is people, and it's similar with Alexa and things like this, people who are able to design conversations with kind of branching and effective calls to action and all the rest of it. It's a very different, more three-dimensional type of skill, and I can see that moving into learning in a big way before we ever get to analysis of big data sets.
I was just going to say, I guess on kind of one hand, that does bring in an extra kind of human level to technology. Are either of you kind of concerned about how that can potentially kind of narrow the experience as well? Because potentially, I guess, there's only so much kind of routing from that sequence. So is there a concern around kind of removing, serendipity from learning and search and so on?
I'm less sure about that. And so I think there might be in that very specific case of the conversational bot potentially, but generally with the access to media and the internet we're all coming across learning opportunities in so many different ways, I think. And I think there's a lot of evidence that people were concerned about, even in politics, people getting narrower views, but actually all the evidence is that people are getting a much wider range of views now than they ever got because of what's out there, really. So I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think a lot of it goes back to still some of the basics, really, which is like there's an old media theory called uses and gratifications, really from the 70s, which is that people are active as an audience. They're aware of their needs and they know what gratifications they want. And therefore, what they really need is to have expectations and evaluate what media can meet those needs and give them the gratifications they want. And I think sometimes we need to go back to that, because I think a lot of people are aware of their needs. I mean, some people aren't, but a lot of people are aware of my needs in terms of what I need to learn, etc. So it's therefore, you're providing learning materials for them. What expectations do they expect that will gratify their needs? And because that's what you need to persuade them of, because that's why they'll engage. And I think some people evaluate it and think it's not actually going to do that. Course and skill stuff is really not going to do what I need in terms of managing this individual in my team, for example. So it's going back, I think, to really the basics. There's a really old media theory back into the 70s, but it's about how do you identify needs and then develop things which people expect to gratify their needs. And that's the important thing, is they have to expect it to gratify their needs in order for them to engage with it, really.
So that would mean that people are making a good decision by not necessarily always doing the mandatory learning that they're being presented with in-house, in terms of kind of gratification.
I think it's how do you influence those expectations, because the expectations will determine whether they take that course or not, really. So, and I think that's where, and I think Netflix would have got much better at that in terms of how you meet that, to sort of they're all the time promoting programs. So will this meet your need for an action movie? Actually, here's a list of action movies that were highly rated, and these are the ones that were linked to the last one you liked. So that's probably going to meet your need. And we could do possibly more of that in learning. It doesn't always work in Netflix, but what they're trying to do is, okay, you're in a particular mood. They're trying to help you navigate to something, because they need it to gratify your expectations. So that, cause the other part of the theory is, of course, if it does gratify your need, you come back, and if it doesn't, you don't. Yeah. And so,
do we have the right kind of culture of listening and interpreting data in learning development to have that happen? Because you can imagine certain types of heads of L&D saying, well, the problem is their expectations, and we're here to kind of change their expectations. That again seems to be a difference between the consumer world and the learning world, is that your kind of frame of reference in marketing is very much down to what they already want and how we can give it to them.
But there is a thing about evaluation, though. You still need to evaluate that people are enjoying it, I think it's effective. And so there's a whole evaluation side of learning, which is it really gratifying and meeting the needs that people have?
And historically, we have a problem there, because evaluation was
really
the first
good
thing
evaluation. Not did you have
budget.
a happy experience attending this course, etc. But has it really worked 3 months down the line? Has it changed your behaviour? Most learning is about changing behaviours. Are we getting the feedback that it's doing what it needs to do? So I like things like Net Promoter Score in marketing, which is really simple. I mean, I really love a little tool called Satismeter. You can put on any website and it just pops up.
Sorry, what's the name of that?
Satismeter. It's a really simple little tool. You just build a JavaScript, stick on site, and it just says, would you recommend us from 1 to 10? And we use it on our BuzzSumo site all the time. And every month I'd look at it, because hundreds of people would just click, because it was just clicking a button. And that gave you some feedback. If people are scoring you 9s or 10s or 2s or 3s, that's quite different feedback. And that's actually doesn't have to be difficult. I mean, you could say, would you recommend this course to a friend? 1 to 10. And basically, if they're not scoring 9 or 10, we know from the Net Promoter Score theory, people really aren't.
But that's happy sheet level, moving into Kirkpatrick levels 3, 4 and 5.
Yeah. It's a tricky one, isn't it? I mean, I actually think NPS scores are useful if you, of course, ask the question why, and then analyse it and act on it.
Which is where conversational surveys could possibly come in time.
But I'm just saying it doesn't have to be so complicated, because you do take into a range of things. Not did you enjoy the course, but recommending it on is you think it's got value if you're going to recommend it on. So people make a judgment call about it. But I think you do need to have that feedback, because I think, as I come back to this point about products, your best marketing is your product. So if you're producing learning which is helping people do their jobs better, you won't have a problem getting people to do it. Personally, I think that's the key.
I'd like to top off the discussion by asking both of you what's one thing that you've seen in marketing that you think is really fantastic, that would be useful for learning people that they're not doing at the moment?
Yeah, mine's going to be quite boring in a sense. I would go back to that role of influencers in marketing. I think marketers understand how that work and how to build relationships with influencers, so that you're not just pushing stuff out there in whatever form, but you've got a network of advocates who are helping you to get that stuff out there. So I would really think about, who are the 10, 12 people for this course who are really advocating it in your organisation? Because if you haven't got them, then it's not happening. So think about, who are the advocates? So for every course you build, who are the 10 advocates who are going to recommend it to people? And you get them on board, as you say, by co-creating and other things, so there's advocates involved. But for every piece, you need to think who's advocating it out there, because you can't expect to just put it out there and expect people to find it.
And digital can help you do that.
Yeah, digital can definitely do that.
Complementary to that is helping people, I guess, share their stories and co-create the experience and the brand as part of that. And I think there's still quite a long way to go there, but there's a huge opportunity in terms of engagement and also the learning itself that will come out of making those connections.
Okay, and I'd like to put in my conversational marketing, conversational design things. All of us should be innovating and experimenting and finding ways to use what technology throws up in order to make other people's lives better.
Hear, hear.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Huge thanks to Cheryl and Steve for those fascinating insights. The Learning Hack is completely independent of any vendor, company or body and funded transparently by sponsors. So if you want to help us sustain it into the future, please make sure to like and subscribe and give us a 5-star rating on whatever platform you get your podcasts from. If you want to sponsor, you can reach me at John Helmer on Twitter or through my website, johnhelmerconsulting.com. Next time on The Learning Hack, we have the inimitable Nick Shackleton-Jones talking about how people really learn. I know he's been on everybody's podcast, but I put him some questions he doesn't normally get asked, so don't miss it. See you then, and until next time, bye-bye.
Now I finally get it.
Well, that's a really boring note of kind of unanimity to end on, but yeah. So I said.